If you are struggling with your dip technique and you can't seem to progress, this video is for you. For dip, we need to bring our arm behind the body while bending it and then reversing the movement on the way up. The moment we start to load this movement, the main challenge will be to maintain a proper scapulohumeral rhythm while performing the movement. We can then see usually two different extremes which are actually sharing the same problem that will cause the fuck up of your dip technique. For the purpose of this video, we will call the first extreme the shrug dip. And what happens here is that the athlete is not able to maintain a stable shoulder while performing the shoulder extension movement. Instead, what happens is the moment the arm moves behind the body, the whole shoulder complex starts to shrug up and roll upward and forward on the ribcage. And the interesting part here is that we need this skill of maintaining a stable shoulder while moving the arm backwards also in other movements like push-ups, rows, and pull-ups. And athletes who are not able to do that, you will see the same compensation happen also in those different types of movements. The second extreme that will fuck up your dip technique is exactly the opposite. So instead of not regulating the shoulder movement at all, athletes tend to overly stiffen up. They will keep the pecs tight, they will stiffen up the lats, and they will do anything to avoid movement at the shoulder. And if we're stiffening up in our shoulder joint, the movement needs to be compensated somewhere. And that is when you see athletes dipping with a lot of hip hinge or with a lot of spine bending and then extension on the way up. Because in order to move up and down, movement needs to be created somewhere. And if it's stiffen up at the shoulder, just the elbow and the hip and spine area remains. Powerful dips, of course, need powerful equipment, and all of it you can get in our King of Weighted shop. Starting with the SL Pro adjustable dip bars, where you can really adjust the width of the bars to your needs, going over to the King of Weighted belt so you can properly load your dips up to 300 kg, SL Pro performance wrist wraps, stabilizing your wrist joint, and of course the SL Pro elbow sleeves, which are especially very helpful for competitive athletes as they will help you a ton in the bottom position to really smash some nice new PRs. Get everything at kingofweighted.shop. In the next step, we want to take a look at why both of these techniques are actually problematic or can become problematic for you. The first reason why both of these techniques can become problematic is that with both of these styles, we are not very good in managing our center of mass. In order to be able to push our body weight up and later on with weighted calisthenics a lot of load, we want to achieve a center of mass that is roughly in line with our wrists, especially in the bottom position of the dip, because then we are really able to exert force in the way up and really translate all of our power into that movement. If our center of mass is too far in the front or too far in the back because our technique forces us in an arched or in a very crunched position, then we're gonna have a problem to grind up that repetition and to exert a lot of force. Reason number two why both of these techniques can become problematic and fuck up your dip is because we also need a good force coupling in our body itself. That means we want to have a proper and stable scapular position. We want to have an upper arm that can move properly in the socket of its shoulder, is centered and stable there, so that when the muscles start to pull on our skeleton, that we can actually transfer force and bring our muscles into a position where they can have a good leverage in order to actually push decent amounts of load. If we have a shrugged up scapula, that is not the case. We cannot leverage our chest as good. We don't have a stable scapular position that allows our upper arm to accept a lot of force. And if we are in a crunched position and the arm is not behind our body, we won't be able to use our chest to bring that arm forward. We're relying a lot on our triceps, and we're missing out on a lot of potential in order to create force, especially in the bottom position. Now that we understood what the problem with those two dip techniques is, we can start to initiate the unfuck process and start to understand what a proper dip really does. The first and one of the most important parts of a strong dip is that we want to remain as good as possible in a stacked position. That means we want our rib cage to be roughly parallel to our hips. So we want to avoid positions where those two structures rotate away from each other. That would be that scenario or that scenario. In both cases, what happens is that we are creating energy leaks, because especially for weight dips and heavier weighted dips, we want to transfer the force into the weight. We want to move it up and down. And if the force coupling inside our body gets lost because we cannot transfer force over a braced and stable structure from our shoulders down to the weight, then we won't be able to have a strong dip in the first place. In order to create a proper stack, we need to be able to brace properly. And learning to brace and stack properly is not only a skill that we need for dips, but we need it for pull-ups as well, for muscle-ups, for deadlifts, for squats. So for all exercises where we want to stabilize our spine without stiffening up too much, because we want to allow ribcage movement to happen, but in the right areas. And how you can learn to brace properly and to stack properly is with the so-called 90-90 breathing. It's called 90-90 breathing because we have roughly a 90-degree angle in the hips and roughly a 90-degree angle at the knees. Now, we want to place our lower back flat on the floor, and we want to create a bit of tension with our hamstrings. So you just jam those heels into the bench slightly so that you feel a bit of tension in your hamstrings. That will help us to learn to bring our pelvis in a neutral position. Then you place your head comfortably on the floor. You don't want to tuck it because you want to keep your airways open. Now, I would recommend you to use your hands and put them on your side abs. And now the process is pretty easy. You just exhale through your open mouth until you're fully running out of air and you feel those side abs contract. And you will notice that the sternum and those lower ribs are coming down, and you get those 360 degrees of core activation like that. Now everything is nice and tight. I'm still pushing my heels into the bench. And now I keep this tightness and I will silently breathe into my nose. And what you will feel is that due to your side abs holding onto those lower ribs is that you're actually breathing the air into your upper rib cage here in the front side and here in the back side. And this is the important part of this exercise, to allow movement to happen in these parts of the rib cage, because these parts will allow proper scapular movement to happen, because that is, at least on the back side, where the scapula sits and where the scapula moves. And if we're compressed and not able to move these ranges and access this expansion, then we also won't be able to have proper dip mechanic in the first place. So what I want you to do before your next dip workout is just go with 3 sets of 5 to 10 in and exhales. So again, breathe out through the open mouth until your side abs turn on. Hold the tension, hamstrings are under tension, and then silently breathe in through your nose. Now you just try to translate what you learned in the 90-90 breathing into your dip position. So we will pull the toes up in order to create a bit of that hamstring sensation to move our pelvis into a neutral position, we will go into a neutral shoulder position, sternum stays neutral, and then exhale until your side abs turn on, and then silently inhale through the nose. Once you feel comfortable and you mastered that position, of course you don't need to go through that full breathing cycle for every repetition. You will have it easier over time to get into that stacked position without that cycle up front. Once you master the stacked position, the second stage of unfucking your dip is to learn a proper shoulder extension movement. And to understand how that works, we need to take a look at the requirements for shoulder extension in the first place. And in order to bring that arm behind the body, our upper arm needs a bit of internal rotation. And at the same time, the scapula, if we're bringing the arm behind the back, needs to retract and elevate a bit. That means we want to create a starting position of a dip that allows internal rotation, retraction, and elevation to a certain degree to happen without restricting the movement. And at the same time, that position should not activate the antagonist too much that they start to avoid this movement. If we're going into that starting position, if we want to have shoulder extension, we need to start in the position of external rotation for our upper arm in order to let internal rotation happen. If we're starting fully internal rotated, there is no room to move into further internal rotation and shoulder extension won't happen. The second thing that we need is that we want to have a neutral shoulder position. We don't want to depress all the way, because if we're depressing all the way, we will activate the antagonist. So our chest and lats a lot, as they are strong depressors, and we won't be able to let the arm move backwards and will be stiffened up in that depressed and internal rotated position. So a neutral position is just fine, so that we have a bit of room to move into elevation. Second thing is, we don't want to start fully retracted, because also then there's no further room to move into retraction. So also here, neutral position is just fine. We don't need to fully protract, because then again, we will activate the antagonist and we will rather harm the movement instead of regulating it. When it comes to improving your shoulder extension, there are two exercises that I can recommend you next to practicing it in the dip itself that really help you to understand the movement. And the first one are rows. Simple rows, you can do them unilateral, bilateral, on the cable, on the rings, doesn't really matter. What we want to focus on is that we let the weight pull our shoulders forward into a nice stretch. And then, without shrugging up our shoulder, we just focus on bringing the elbows backwards. We don't jam our sternum up. We don't pull the shoulder blade in a retraction. We just naturally move the arm back. And yes, a bit of retraction will happen, a bit of elevation will happen, but you don't force it. You focus on bringing that elbow behind the body without losing that stack. So you stay in a neutral position here and here. And how that looks, I will show you now. A second very nice exercise in order to understand the shoulder extension movement are unilateral chest presses or costal pec press, however you want to call it. And you just need a cable for that and maybe something to hold on to so that you can stabilize yourself. You can also use the other side of the cables if you have a more narrow tower. And then you just focus again on staying in a stacked position. Staggered stance can be helpful in order to keep more stability. And then what you do is you basically perform in your stacked position this dip movement. If you don't have any cables available, you could also work with regular push-ups where you focus on a clean shoulder extension movement while not shrugging up. You can also use dumbbell presses in a hook-lying position, so where you put your feet on the bench. These will also do the job just fine. Now you nearly have everything that you need in order to unfuck your dip. Now, you really need to remember that whenever you trained yourself into a certain technique for months, maybe even years, that changing this technique pattern takes time and practice. So don't be frustrated if your dip still looks not as you want to have it after a couple of sessions. Make sure to integrate your assistance exercises in order to be able to create your stack and to be able to have a mechanically nice shoulder extension. Then decrease the intensity of your dip whenever you're working on your new technique to make sure that you can actually focus on this. And the rest is time and practice, repetitive practice. So be patient.